Hello, my dear students in Kairodar. We'll explain the absorption of water and salts as a first step of the autotrophic nutrition in the plant. As shown in this slide, the presence of Casparian strip in the endodermal cells that allow the water to pass from the root hair to the xylem vessels. The presence of cyprine, the wall is complete thickened with cyprine at the walls that facing the phloem, but at the walls that facing the xylem vessels, the absence of cyprine, that to facilitate the passage of water from the root hair to reach the xylem vessels and can't reach the phloem. That's the function of the Casparian strip, which is made of cyprine. Therefore, the endodermal cells are called the passage cells. Passage cells means the cells or the endodermal cells that facing the xylem vessels at one direction and the root hair of the other one, that allow the water to pass to the xylem and preventing it to reach the phloem. So the absorption or the autotrophic nutrition takes place by two successive steps. The first is the absorption of water and salts. The second is the photosynthesis. But the absorption of water that takes place by the three ways, but the absorption of salts that are called the nutrients. So the plant, the nutrients that needed by the nutrients that needed by the plant are called the salts or ions that present inside the soil in the form of cations or anions. So the nutrients of the plant are divided into three main groups. The first is the essential nutrients. The second is the macronutrients. The third is the micronutrient. The essential nutrients are the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. If you remember that the glucose molecule consists of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. That's the three essential nutrients that need by the plant or any living organism to still survive. But the other nutrients are divided into macro and the micronutrients. The macronutrients are called the nutrients that needed by the plant with a considerable amount. They are 7 nutrients, as a potassium, phosphorus, calcium, sulfur, magnesium, iron, and nitrogen. ممكن نجمع الماكرونيوترينز كده نقول عليها كارب ماجنيز كافيه. لو كتبنا الكلمة ديت هنعرف ال 7 nutrients. لكن المايكرونيوترينز which are called the trace elements. The trace elements are elements needed by the plant with a very small amount. Therefore, they are called the trace elements. They just activate the enzymes. But the macronutrients get in the building of the plant structure that responsible for carrying out photosynthesis. But the micronutrients are 8 elements. The 8 elements are aluminium, zinc, manganese, molybdenum, boron, chlorine, iodine, and copper. ممكن نقول كلمة صغيرة، نقول ايه الزن من موبيكليكيو، نكتبها كده على جنب نلاقي احنا عرفنا خلاص كل الماكرو والمايكرو نيوترينتس. يبقى الماكرو نيوترينتس بنقول عليها ايه كابو ماجنيز كافيه، التاني الزن من موبيكليكيو. خلاص يبقى احنا خلصنا من مشكلة ان يجي يقول لي في سؤال مالتيبل تشويس فروم ذا ماكرو نيوترينتس كذا او مايكرو نيوترينتس، الكلام ده يبقى سهل قوي. لكن the absorption of water takes place by 3 ways and also the absorption of nutrients takes place by 3 ways. The absorption of water and salts takes place from cell sap to cell sap by osmosis, cellular and intercellular spaces by imbibition, from one cell to the neighbor one through the plasmodesmata. But the absorption of salts takes place by 3 ways. The first is the diffusion. What about the diffusion? We understand that the diffusion is the movement of molecules or ions from high concentrated medium to low concentrated medium due to the continuous free motion of molecules. So the ions are located inside the soil in the form of cations or anions. That means in the form of positive ions and negative ions. If the concentration of ions in the soil or outside the plant higher than that inside the plant, the ions move from high concentrated medium to low concentrated medium. That takes place by diffusion. But at the opposite side, or the concentration of ions inside the plant higher than that, the concentration of the same ions in the soil where the plant live, that takes place against the concentration gradients. That's called the active transport. So the active transport is a passage of any substance through the plasma membrane against the concentration gradient that need chemical energy released from the aerobic respiration. واحنا بنقول ديفيوجن يعني كوبري كده، عربيه نازله من فوق الكوبري نازله تحت، مش محتاج ازود بنزين ولا حاجه، ممكن اطفي العربيه ومن غير انرجي هتنزل. لكن تحت الكوبري عايز اطلع الكوبري، لا هنا لازم انرجي. يبقى في الاولى لما كان فروم هاي تو لو ده كنا بنسميه with the concentration gradient. لكن العكس وانت طالع الكوبري ده اسمه against the concentration gradient، يبقى ده need chemical energy. الروتس بتاعت البلانت والروت هير بتجيب الكيميكال انرجي منين؟ from the aerobic respiration. That means burning sugar at the presence of oxygen that release the energy in the form of ATP. Therefore, that's called the chemical energy that released from the aerobic respiration. So, the first step that needed by the plant to absorb the salts is the diffusion. The second is the active transport, but the third is the selectively permeability. Selectively permeability means the membrane can allow some ions to pass through it and prevent the others that according to the requirement of the cell. But also the active transport act as a kind of selectively permeability. That means the plant need certain ions with the concentration higher than the other one. But what is the difference between active transport and diffusion? We remember that the active transport is a kind of selectively permeability, but the diffusion is not act as a kind of selectively permeability, because the active transport is the movement of any substance against the concentration gradient that through the plasma membrane with the help of chemical energy, but in diffusion, at the example of drop of ink in beaker containing water. So no selection takes place in the diffusion. Also, the active transport is the movement from low to high or against the concentration gradient, but in diffusion with the concentration gradient. The against of concentration gradient in the active transport need chemical energy, but there is no energy is needed during the diffusion. The presence of energy that needs the presence of living membranes that to respire to release the energy, but in diffusion there is no need of the living membrane or doesn't need the presence of energy. But the example of the active transport is the passage of ions inside the plant from low concentrated medium in the outside the plant to higher one as that in the Nutella algae. But in the case of the diffusion, at the presence of drop of ink in beaker containing water or the passage of ions from the soil where high concentrated medium to get inside the plant where low concentrated medium. So the Nutella algae prove the presence of active transport because the concentration of ions inside the Nutella algae as shown in the figure, the concentration of ions inside the Nutella algae that represented by the green column that higher than the concentration of the same ion in water where the Nutella algae live. So the concentration of ions inside the Nutella algae higher than that of the water where the Nutella algae lives that proves the presence of the active transport. But the ions inside the Nutella algae is not equal each other. The Nutella algae need the absorption of chlorine ions higher than that of the sodium ions. That because that prove that the active transport act as a kind of selectively permeability with the ability of the membrane to absorb ions according to the requirement of the cell. So the presence of the Nutella algae or the concentration of ions inside the Nutella algae proves the active transport. But to prove that the active transport need energy, we carry out the experiment by using the barley plant. We supply the roots of barley plant with the sulfate salts SO4 containing radioactive sulfur 35 and divide the plant into two groups or carry the experiment twice, one of them at the presence of oxygen and the other at the absence of oxygen. The graph that's shown in this slide is that explain that the absorption of salts or the radioactive sulfur 35, that's radioactive to be indicated by Geiger counter, the presence of the ions or the absorption of ions against the concentration gradient that at the presence of oxygen need energy. So the absorption of salts at the presence of oxygen higher than that at the absence of oxygen, because the burning food, especially sugar, to release energy at the presence of oxygen release great amount of energy equal about 38 molecules of ATP, but at the absence of oxygen the glucose molecule release 2 molecules of ATP only. So when the at the presence of oxygen, the amount of energy increased, so the absorption of salts increased. The experiment of parallel plan to prove that the absorption of salts against the concentration gradient need energy, so the experiment of parallel plan to prove that the active transport need energy or absorption of salts at the presence of oxygen. That's the end. Thank you very much. Goodbye and good luck.